Hello everyone and welcome to today's video on Cardiff killers and mysteries. If you're watching this from Cardiff, please drop a comment and leave a thumbs up. Today's story is about Dai Lewis and the innocent hanged. Dai Lewis was very well known in Cardiff as a rugby player and welterweight boxing champion. He was known for being strong-built and tough. Although boxing had given him a fantastic career and everyone knew his name, the fame didn't keep the money coming in, and at 31 years old, Dai Lewis was falling on hard times. Dai Lewis decided to get into the bookmaker's business and run his own protection racket, renting out supplies such as chalkboards, tables, and even buckets of water. But if someone couldn't pay up or refused to, they would have their tables tossed over and be given a beating to remember. As Dai Lewis worked alone, he was preferred by other bookmakers as he was less of a threat than those in gangs. Dai Lewis knew a good amount of people in the bookmaking business, some of which included Danny Driscoll, 35, who was also a former boxer and a bookmaker, and the brothers Edward and John Rowlands, 40 and 30 years old, Cardiff's notorious gang leaders of the 40 Thieves. Thugs who terrorised the local horse racing courses and ran their very own successful and established protection racket, often leaving those who crossed them with a familiar scar to the cheek. On the 27th of September 1927, Edward and John Rowlands invited Dai Lewis to the Monmouth steeplechase. There, Dai Lewis caused a ruckus when John Rowlands confronted Dai, apparently about him working on John's turf and owing him money, but whispers said it was about a deal they had made previously. It was said that John Rowlands had given Dai Lewis some small jewellery items worth up to £4,500 to hold on to, but Dai explained he was robbed and lost the loot that was stolen from the mail robbery. Whether it was hearsay or not, John Rowlands was upset and demanded Dai pay what he had made hiring out his own bookmaker's equipment at the Monmouth steeplechase, which was quite a few pounds. John Rowlands reminded Dai that this was in fact John's territory and that he had crossed a line. Dai Lewis refused to pay up, even stating he wasn't afraid of him. Although Dai Lewis claimed he wasn't afraid of John Rowlands' threats, that night Dai Lewis did not return home to his house on Ethel Street in Canton to his wife Annie Lewis and his 5 children. A wise choice maybe, as just a few streets over on Turner Street was the Rowlands family home, and instead Dai Lewis rented a room in a lodging house on St Mary Street. On the 28th, the very next day, Dai Lewis returned to the Monmouth steeplechase and had yet again another successful day with the bookmakers. By this time, John Rowlands had become furious and decided he would pay Dai Lewis a visit and teach him a lesson once and for all. That evening, Dai celebrated with a few drinks at the Blue Anchor pub at 63 St Mary Street, where the Peppermint Bar resides today. There, he was drinking with Danny Driscoll and Edward Rowlands. Unknown to Dai, John Rowlands sat in a nearby cafe with John Hughes, 44, and William Joseph Price, 43, his fellow gang members. When the bells rang for closing at 11 p.m, Dai made his way back to the lodging house, which was across the street from the Blue Anchor. But sadly, he only made it halfway across the road when a group of men huddled around him, and as Dai fell to the ground, the men hesitated for a bit and then ran off. Dai Lewis was left lying on the ground in a pool of his own blood. His throat had been slit and he was bleeding out. Ladies of the night that witnessed the event had rushed over to help Dai Lewis. One lady ripped her petticoat in order to wrap around Dai's neck to stop the bleeding. The police and ambulance were called, and Dai Lewis was rushed to the Cardiff Royal Infirmary. Medical practitioners tried to save Dai's life, but the 7-inch gaping wound to his throat was so deep it severed his windpipe. They could only close up the initial wound, leaving blood to cascade into his lungs. Meanwhile, reporters were sent out to investigate this horrific case as a story and sent out a junior reporter named Sydney Graves at 12:15 a.m. to Dai Lewis's home in Ethel Street to inform his wife and father who lived with him of Dai's accident and get information on Dai Lewis himself. Annie Lewis arrived at the hospital to spend his last minutes with him. While Dai Lewis was slowly dying, choking on his own blood, multiple calls came through to the hospital asking about his condition. The nurse found this suspicious and informed the police officers who waited outside Dai Lewis's hospital room door in case the critically injured man would be able to speak and identify his attacker. The police asked the nurse to prolong the next call so they would be able to trace it. Eventually, the nurse was able to do so, and the call was traced back to the Colonial Club on Custom House Road, Cardiff. The calls, in fact, came from Danny Driscoll. Annie Lewis and the officers involved in the case were told that David Dai Lewis was not expected to live through the night. Although Dai Lewis had a critical injury, he was able to speak in a weak voice and said, "I do not know how I have been injured. There was no quarrel or fight. I didn't see anyone use a knife." Officers arrested John Rowlands, Edward Rowlands, John Hughes, William Joseph Price, and Daniel Driscoll on suspicion of murder. Danny Driscoll was said to have asked the police officers if his arrest was a sick joke. All 5 suspects were brought into the dying man's hospital room to see if Dai Lewis would tell the police who attacked him. But instead, Dai Lewis's last words were those of friendship and love. He said by quote, "Edward never laid a hand on me. We've been best friends." Dai then turned to Danny Driscoll and said, "You had nothing to do with it either. We were talking and laughing together, my dear old pal." But Dai said nothing about John Rowlands at all, or his friends, John Hughes and William Joseph Price. David Dai Lewis died the next day in his wife's arms. Since Dai Lewis was a professional athlete and a local hero, his death was a huge shock to the people of Cardiff, and more than 25,000 people lined the streets of Cardiff on the 3rd of October 1927 when Dai Lewis was buried. A few days later, John Rowlands confessed to the murder of David Dai Lewis, but claimed it was a mistake. He was meant to send him a message and scar him on the cheek, but Dai struggled and John sliced his neck instead. Edward Rowlands and Danny Driscoll first claimed they had not been in the area at all, but once evidence came out to disprove their claim, they changed their statement. And Edward Rowlands claimed they walked out of the Blue Anchor pub, observed the fight from a distance, and ran off when the crowd dispersed. Danny Driscoll told investigators the same story in an independent interview. There was no evidence whatsoever that John Hughes, John Rowlands' henchman, participated in the attack, and as a result, he was released. The Rowlands brothers, Edward and John, along with Danny Driscoll and William Joseph Price, still remained in police custody and awaited trial. The trial, which began at Cardiff Crown Court on the 29th of November, was overseen by Justice Wright. The court proceedings lasted 3 days and was muddled with a good deal of contradictory and fleeting eyewitnesses' testimonies. The prosecutions had 3 witnesses, 2 policemen and a prostitute. John Rowlands' other henchman, William Joseph Price, was acquitted, but both Edward and Daniel were accused of giving phony alibis. And despite the victim and all the witnesses stating that Edward Rowlands and Daniel Driscoll did not engage in the fight, Danny Driscoll and Edward Rowlands were being charged with aiding and abetting the scene. The Rowlands brothers and Danny Driscoll were sentenced to hang. Immediately after the trial, there were many protests of people who expressed belief that Edward Rowlands and Danny Driscoll were innocent. No concrete evidence had been introduced at the trial to prove that they actually had something to do with the attack. Several petitions of innocence and more than 250,000 signatures were forwarded to the officials begging them to review the verdict. An appeal was heard but shortly dismissed. This left many people believing that the murder gave police a pretext to target some gangland figures that they were keen to get rid of. John Rowlands, the confessed knife wielder, went mad under the pressure of the proceedings and the sentencing of his brother Edward and dear friend Danny Driscoll to death by hanging. For the first time in the history of crime, 8 members of the original jury, which convicted Edward and Danny, issued a statement that explained Edward Rowlands and Daniel Driscoll should not receive the death penalty. The plea was answered by Home Secretary, who stated, "No regard can be paid to expression of opinion by an individual member of the jury by which a person can be convicted. But from the moment of their conviction, Edward Rowlands and especially Danny Driscoll were subject to the intense public support." An appeal was launched and friends and family of Driscoll raised £500, which would equal £34,000 at today's value, to help towards the legal fees in a matter of hours. As many as 500,000 signed petitions for Driscoll's release nationwide. The Liverpool dockhands even threatened to strike. And still, the Crown Courts were uninterested and stated, "It is a fixed and necessary rule that the individual views of the jurymen must not be allowed to influence the exercise of the royal prerogative of mercy. Jurymen may support an appeal for the mercy, like the rest of the public, but once a unanimous verdict is given, the individual jurors cannot qualify it." John Rowlands was found unfit to plea after his mental breakdown, and only the admitted killer, John Rowlands, would be spared the noose. Instead, he would be committed to the Broadmoor prison for the criminally insane. All while his brother Edward Rowlands and Daniel Driscoll begged for their mercy. On the night before their execution, both Edward Rowlands and Danny Driscoll declared they had nothing whatsoever to do with David Dai Lewis's murder. Danny Driscoll spent his last night playing cards as thousands of his supporters gathered outside the doors of the prison to weep and pray as the morning hanging approached. A voice of a young girl sang "Faith of Our Fathers," and thousands joined in with her, and the streets were filled with song. The next morning, Danny Driscoll announced, "Well, I am going down for something I never done, but you don't have to pay twice. Which noose is mine?" Danny Driscoll and Edward Rowlands were hanged next to each other at 8 a.m. on the 27th of January 1928 at Cardiff Prison. At the cathedral the next day, the Catholic priest, Danny Driscoll's confessor, said they had hanged an innocent man at Cardiff's jail this morning. Danny Driscoll came from a very large family and was the eldest of 12 brothers. He served as a gunner in the First World War. David Dai Lewis is buried in Catay's Cemetery. Danny Driscoll and Edward Rowlands are buried in unmarked graves within the walls of Cardiff Prison. The actor Christopher Driscoll is Danny Driscoll's nephew. Christopher and his solicitor, Bernard de Maid, began a renewed campaign in 1990 to posthumously pardon Danny Driscoll. Thank you all for watching. Send in your kutches from my heart to yours. Until next time, bye bye.